Hello Year 3, it's Miss Hendy here. It's Wednesday, which means including today, we only have 3 more days of home learning left, and then we're going to be going back to school. So for this lesson today, you don't need to write the date and title because we're going to be creating a game which you can bring in next week when we return to school and to help you with the different parts of the river. Okay, so that's what we're learning about today, to understand the parts of a river. So before we move on, we'll have a little look at this image here. Have a little think to yourself. What do you see? What do you think? And what do you wonder? Okay, and as I said today, we're going to be creating a game of memory/snap. So basically, you're going to be creating some definition cards that you'll be able to place memory and snap with to help you remember different parts of the river. So bronze, silver and gold are doing this. Based on which challenge you choose today, depends is how many words that you do, so the vocabulary you're exposed to. So for example, bronze have 6 parts of the river, silver have about 9, and I can't remember how much gold had exactly, but you have even more vocabulary than the other 2. And then challenge, if you'd like to push yourself a little bit further, is to draw a river with the different parts and label it, including the upper, middle and lower course. But before we do any of that, we're going to do a quick total recall before we get started. So first of all, I'd like you to name 3 sources of light. Okay, so you could have had fire, candle, the sun, a light bulb, anything that creates light, that the light comes from. Number 2, where the river begins is called from last lesson, do you remember? It's the source of the river. And then finally, which year was Boudicca's rebellion? It was AD 60, so well done if you remembered that, because that was from last term, so it's quite tricky. Okay, so let's get started.
Today you're going to be introduced to a lot of new, challenging vocabulary, and it's important that actually you just persevere when you find things a little bit tricky. So the key vocabulary that I was talking about, we have source, mouth, tributaries, meander, floodplains, confluence, waterfall, upper course, middle course, lower course, stream, spring and groundwater. So it's a lot of vocabulary there. Just press pause, have a think. Which of those words do you already know? And which do you need to learn? Okay, so before we start introducing all that new vocabulary, some of it we have seen before, let's have a little recap about what we learned in last lesson. I want you to have a little think about the video that we played of the water pouring down the rocks that represented our hill. What can you remember from that? What did the rain pouring down represent? Okay. So last week we learned how a river always flows downhill because of gravity. You'll learn about gravity more when you're in year 5. We learned that the river we learned that the place where the river begins is called the source, and where the river meets the sea is the mouth. And we also talked about how powerful water can be and how it can cut through sand, soil, and even rocks over time. Actually, that makes links back to our science topic of rocks in the spring term. So today we're going to be looking at that journey from the source to the mouth where it reaches the sea. So before we do that, I just want to have a little look at the major rivers of Britain. So our closest one is the River Tamar, and some of you would have had the opportunity to see where the source was, and all of you have had the opportunity to see the river. And if you remember back to when we studied bridges, we actually went on a boat and got to ride up to the River Tamar, which was really lovely. The River Thames is in London, and interestingly, and there are lots of people are quite surprised by this, the River Thames is the cleanest major river to run through a major city in the world. So in about 50-60 years ago, it was actually one of the uncleanest. It was biologically dead, so nothing could live in it, but actually because of all the efforts they've put into it, it's now one of the cleanest rivers that runs through a major city in the world. So I wonder if you can spot any others. there that you recognise. So those, I know some people have been to Scotland in the year group, and I know some people have lived there before and are moving there. So that's the River Clyde up in Scotland. Okay. So first of all, before we start doing all the talking parts, we're going to have a little recap and re-watch this video that we watched last week. Can you take any notes of the parts of the river that you've not heard of before as you watch it? And it's ready. Okay.
Following the route of a river that flows across the country and out to the sea, I'm starting from the beginning of the river, which we call the source, here in the mountains. Rivers often start in upland areas like this, from lakes, marshes and glaciers, or even springs that bubble out of the ground. A river has a channel with banks on both sides and a bed. Around the main channel of the river is the floodplain, where the river expands when it floods. Rivers always flow downhill because of gravity, going where there is the least resistance. So they meander or move around obstacles like large rocks and hills. Over time, they erode or wear away soil and rock to create canyons and gorges. My kayak is being pushed along by the water as it gradually flows downhill. The water looks quite flat here, but in other places it can be much steeper, like waterfalls. Rivers like the Amazon and Nile are nearly 7,000 kilometers long and can be several kilometers wide in some places. Some rivers flow into lakes or other larger rivers. Finally, I've reached the mouth of the river, which in this case flows out to the sea. I think I'm going to need a bigger boat.
Okay, so did you take a note of any of the new parts that you've heard today of the river? So have a little think, see if you can spot them throughout the lesson. So we'll start with right at the beginning, okay, so at the source, we have the clouds. They release their rain over the hills, and you'll learn more about that when you do the water cycle in year 4. And then most of this soaks into the ground to become groundwater. So groundwater is rain that is soaked into the ground. And some of that groundwater comes to the surface to form springs. And then springs join together to make streams. And as the streams trickle down the hillside, they join together, getting bigger as they go, until they become rivers. So our key vocabulary in there, we have groundwater. So this is where the water soaks into the ground. A spring, springs are when the groundwater comes back up to the surface, and springs join together and they make streams, and streams trickle down the hillside, getting bigger as they go, until they become rivers. So we can divide a river up into 3 sections. We have the upper course, middle course, and lower course. We're going to go through each of those courses to see what parts of the river are in each. So first of all, we have the upper course, and this is where the river begins. And we all know that's called the source. So this is where the river begins, and so we have the rain, becomes groundwater, bubbles up, becomes a spring. They form together, the springs form together to make streams, and that is all at the upper course of the river. So then we move on to the middle course. On either side of the middle course of the river are floodplains, and these areas are flat and they become flooded, and that's why they're called floodplains, because they become flooded when there's really heavy rain and it causes the river to overflow. And then we have something that we learned last lesson, where we have another river or a stream that will join the river, and that is called a tributary. So here we have this river here, and it's joining our main river. The joining point is called a confluence. Okay, so lots of tricky vocabulary. You need to press pause and rewind, have another little listen. That's absolutely fine. So the river will widen to allow for extra water that the joining river brings. Okay, so when a tributary joins, and that join is called the confluence onto the main river, the river will become wider, okay, to allow for that extra water. So also in the middle course is we have meanders. Can you say that? Meanders? Meanders. So a meander is a large bend in the river. If a river floods, the neck of the meander becomes flooded and the river will take this route, because we all know that water always takes the shortest route. Over time, the neck of the meander become the new path of the river. So I'm just going to show you these diagrams here because I think it's the best way to show you. So as you can see, we've got a bend. So a meander is simply a bend in the river. A meander is a bend in the river. You can see the river is flowing around. Okay, but then we have a bit of a flood, and can you see that it's about to join here? What do you think the water is going to do? If the water likes to take the shortest route, is it going to go all the way around here, or is it going to find a different route? It's going to go across that flooded bit. Okay, so that's going to flood, and then we have the bend in the river, and we are now being cut off. So bits of soil will then start to form at the edges, and it gets cut off, and then it's called an oxbow lake, and that's what that shape is, an oxbow lake, and the river is now cut off from it. Okay, just remember, if it's a lot of information today, so if you need to go back and rewind and have another little listen, that's absolutely fine. Then finally, we have the lower course of the river. So the lower course of the river leads to the mouth of the river. So this is where the river meets the sea. So the lower course of the river has larger meanders, so larger bends in the river. Remember, meander is a bend. The river has energy, and so it carries less material. So it's going to start depositing the soil and other materials to form mini islands. Can you see this one here? In fact, if I get a pen, I can just draw around it, make it very clear. This is like a little island of all the soil and all the materials that the river has deposited to make a small island, and that is called a delta. A delta. So I'm going to write, oh, that's not a very good D. It's so much different than writing with a pen on the board. I'm going to give up with that one. Okay, so that was a lot of information. So you had the three sections of the river. We had the upper course where the source is, the middle of the course where you got these meanders, and then you got the tributaries starting to join in to the main river, making it widen. And then we come towards the lower course of the river where we have lots more meanders, we have soil deposited, and it forms little islands called deltas, and then it meets the sea, and that's the mouth. So we've got our glossary. I'm going to see if you can remember what each one means, and then I'm going to model today's activities. So we have the source. You can remember what the source is. Have a little think. It's the beginning of a river. It's as simple as that. The source is where the river begins. Okay, groundwater. Who can remember what groundwater is? Have a little think. So the groundwater is just the rain that soaks into the ground. Very simple, very technical vocabulary at the same time. Okay, then we have a spring. So we've had the beginning of the river, so that rain soaks into the ground. We've got the spring. What is the spring? Can you remember? So the spring is groundwater that comes up to the surface. And then we have a stream. What is a stream? How would you describe a stream? A stream is a small river. So we get those streams, those really small streams, and they come together, get larger, and become a river. So what is a river? In your own words, how would you describe a river? So a river is a large natural stream of water. And then we have floodplains. We're getting on to that more technical vocabulary now. So a floodplain. Think of that word flood. What does it mean? So a floodplain is the area of flat land either side that's likely to flood. Okay, and these two I'd say they've done in the, I've put them in the wrong order really. We have the confluence. Who can remember what a confluence is? That's very technical vocabulary. Confluence is the point where a tributary joins a river. So what is a tributary? It's a stream or river that joins another river. So confluence is the join, the tributary is the stream or river that's joining. Oh, I see. I wonder if you can remember what a meander is. A meander. So a meander is a bend in the river. It's as simple as that. Meander, a bend in the river. Okay, then we have an oxbow lake. Ooh, an oxbow lake. So when we've had that meander's been that bend in the river and it's flooded, remember water always wants to take the shortest route. So an oxbow lake is a lake created when the meander is cut off. And then we have the mouth to the river. So that's where a river meets the sea. And finally, we have delta. So remember when we came to the lower course of the river, we started to have bigger meanders and lots of energy from the river. So it's starting to deposit lots of the soil and other materials onto a bit of land. And that is called a delta. So it's a small island created by deposited materials, so soil. Okay. So today's task, what you're going to be doing is, I'm going to pop to the visualizer. What you need for this lesson is some cardboard or maybe some paper. I'm just going to use a barbecue box that I have for my recycling. You might want to use a cereal box or a pizza box, anything like that, just to cut up, because we're going to create our own game of Snap, or you can play memory with it as well. So what you would like to do is, with the help of an adult, is to cut some cards. So I'm just going to do one set. So that will be for one word. Now if I show you our resources for today, bronze, you're going to make 12 different cards, and that's for 6 different words, and I'll show you how you can do it in just a moment. Silver, you are going to do it for 9 words, so you have 18 cards. And gold, you have some more technical vocabulary. So bronze is you've got 6 words there, so different main parts of the river. And as you go through silver and gold, the vocabulary gets much more technical. But you have a glossary there for you to use. So for bronze, I'm just going to create the meander card, which has a bend in the river and it's got an image. So if I pop back to it, what I'm going to do is with a pen, you might want to stick some white paper on these to make them nice and clear. Doesn't matter. So I'm going to write meander, and I can write it any way. Oops. I like this, quite tricky. You might have bigger and thicker pens. So on the other, so I've got meander on one card, so I've got what the part of the river is called. And on the other, I'm going to write its definition. So a bend in the river. And remember, you can do this with paper, you don't have to do it with card. So then I'm going to draw on my piece of, on my snap card, the bend in the river. So I'm just going to do this very simply. Okay, so then when I'm playing my game of Snap, or you can do memory as well. So then if one person puts down meander, and then I put down a bend in the river, Snap. Or you can do it so you play in memory, and if I flick over, oh, I've got meander, and I've got a bend in the river, so I get to keep those cards.
So that is your task for today, to create a memory game or Snap game. And I want you to remind you to bring them in for next week, because then we're going to have play with them at the start of our geography lesson, just to recap those different parts. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy making the game. You take care. Have a lovely day. Bye.